A good blank is one that is thick enough to accommodate various hardnesses and densities of cane, and is by definition unfinished, and that is why we must scrape our reeds. Every reed will require a slightly different set of adjustments, and luckily for us, these adjustments are governed by a simple, concrete set of rules. Let's cover some basic information about the material we will be working with, the theory behind adjustments, and the tools that we use. First, let's talk about cane. We have no control over the degree to which these qualities are present in a piece of cane. Some pieces are just better than others, and these qualities are deal breakers in terms of continuing to work on a reed. So what exactly is a high-quality piece of cane? A good piece of cane responds to the trim and doesn't change back. Think about that for a second. If you work on a reed and nothing happens, that reed will never get better. If you work on a reed and it changes, but then it grows back or returns to its original state, that reed will never stay better. Not all good pieces of cane can be made into great reeds, because it would also have to have a high degree of response. But there is really no point in working on a piece of cane at all if you can't affect any changes to it. Degree of response is a confusing concept, but it's really important. This is different from responding to the trim, like we just talked about. This refers to the availability of a dynamic taper. This availability is set in stone for each particular piece of cane, and the degree varies greatly from reed to reed. Basically, can you play very quietly with good intonation, articulation, and quality of tone? This affects the overall range of musical capabilities available to you. And there's a simple test for finding out the degree of response, which I will address in the process goals section later on. But it is important to know that most reeds will never have good response, no matter how much you scrape them. A piece of cane will be somewhere between soft and hard, and somewhere between dense and porous. The hardness and the density often correspond, but not always. These qualities are also set in stone, but good reeds can be made out of a variety of hardnesses and densities. I find that I have to clip 6 to 12 blanks to find one good performance reed that meets all of the criteria. So it responds to the trim, and it doesn't change back, and it has a high degree of response. If I'm playing a concerto or taking an audition, it's more like 30 or 40 blanks per usable reed. So, based on these constraints, our first job as a reed maker is to bring our clipped blanks to a point where we can decide which blank or blanks have the most potential and put our energies into those reeds by adjusting the qualities we do have some control over. We can affect changes to the intonation. We can make it flatter or sharper or more stable. Response, but only to the degree that it exists in that piece in the first place. Strength, we can make it stronger or weaker. Resistance, we can make it more free-blowing or more resistant. And resonance, we can make a reed more lively or more mellow. Again, do not waste your time on reeds that are not made of good cane, because you will get nowhere. Let's talk about how a finished reed should look, and how looking at a reed's existing tapers can help you decide where to work next. The tapers on blanks will vary with the profiler you're using, but the ideal tapers of finished reeds are mostly the same. After putting your reed on the bassoon and actually trying it out, your visual detective work offers the next most important clue as to where to scrape next. The general tapers include the collar to tip taper, and this includes the rails, the spine to rail taper, and the shape of the tip opening. So let's take these one at a time. Reeds should taper from thick to thin, from the back to the front. So from the collar to the tip of the reed, the cane tapers from thick to thin. Underneath the collar to tip overall taper, there are 3 smaller underlying tapers. The first is from the collar to the critical point, which is about 8 millimeters or 5/16 of an inch back from the clipped tip. The second is from the critical point to the tip bevel, or where the tip bevel starts, about 0.5 millimeter or less behind the tip. And the third is from the tip bevel to the actual tip. The 3 tapers are blended and integrated with one another, but each has a slightly steeper rate of taper, beginning with the collar to critical point as the most gradual, and the tip bevel to tip as the most steep. Here are some examples of bad collar to tip tapers. This first reed is too flat in the middle third. It doesn't taper at all. There's also a flat area right behind the tip bevel. This does not follow the rule of thick to thin. This second reed is also really flat towards the front of the reed. It started out nicely, but flattened out, and the tip bevel is quite long and too flat at the tip. This does not follow the rule of thick to thin. This third example is a complete mess. There are bumps and grooves and ridges and holes and valleys. This really does not follow the rule of thick to thin. This last example has some windows carved out in the back, tapering thin to thick, a bump, and a notch behind the tip bevel. Needless to say, this does not follow the rule of thick to thin, and this reed will not play. Related to this taper are the tapers on the rails, and they follow the same rule, thick to thin from the collar to the tip. Here are some examples of bad rail tapers. This top one is quite steep, and there is no taper toward the tip. The second one has no taper at all. It's completely flat. The third one has a much smaller rail on the bottom, and they are uneven. Top one is thicker. The fourth drawing shows no taper till the middle of the reed, then quite a steep taper, and then no taper toward the tip of the reed. This is a common mistake to make. And the bottom drawing is full of bumps and holes. Does not follow the rule from thick to thin. Here are some examples of bad tip bevels. This first one has a cut at the beginning, almost straight down. It tapers okay after that, but this will give you a hitch in your response. The second bevel starts too far back. The angle of it is okay. The bottom bevel is scooped, and it's too thin, too far back. It's not at a steep enough angle, and it does not follow the rule of thick to thin. The spine to rail proportions also taper thick at the spine to thin at the rails. The tapers are steepest at the collar and become more gradual or flatter toward the tip opening. Here are some examples of bad spine to rail tapers. This first example is overall much too flat. The taper is very gradual, and this reed will not have any strength to it. This example is much too rounded in the spine, and there is a very weak spot right in the channels. This does not follow the rule from thick to thin, and will most likely lead to a collapsing reed. This example has a broad, flat spine, It is very rounded in the channels and finally comes to a proper taper near the rails. This does not follow the rule from thick to thin. This last example is probably the result of a mistake with the file or a knife as you're scraping. There's one corner that has been gouged out and is quite weak next to the spine. Then there is a flat area that doesn't taper at all, and it finally resolves to a proper taper near the rail. The collar to tip and spine to rail tapers are integrated by working diagonally all along the blades, and this integration is especially crucial in the thumbnail area. This area is visible when holding a finished reed up to a lamp. And a well-constructed thumbnail is crucial to all aspects of a good reed. Beginning at the critical point, which is about 5/16 of an inch or 8 millimeters back from the clipped tip in the middle of the reed, the thumbnail should taper from thick to thin in all directions. The most important part of the thumbnail, and maybe the whole front third, is the keystone. This is rather like the keystone in the arch of a stone window or door, and it provides strength and resistance to keep the whole window or tip opening from collapsing in on itself. It can be very small, but it must be there. As you become more experienced in reed making, comparing what a reed does look like to what a reed should look like can be helpful in deciding where to work. Remember, thick to thin, back to front, this includes the rails, thick to thin, center to side, and what a surprise, thick to thin for the tip opening as well. The opening of a reed should be shaped more or less like the opening of your mouth, an ellipse that closes evenly beginning at the corners of the mouth to the center. Often, the tip of a freshly clipped and beveled blank will not have this shape, and again, we can use the difference between actual and ideal to help us choose where to work. Here are some examples of bad tip openings. The top one is too thin in the channels, and they're collapsed. This is actually a symptom of bad cane, but you can also achieve this by bad scraping. The second one has one blade, the top blade, that's much stronger than the other. It's much more rounded. The bottom one is flat. Work on the stronger blade first, and perhaps only until you've balanced them out. The third tip opening has an asymmetrical tip. This could be because it's been split badly at the very beginning of the process, or it's bad cane. Work on the stronger areas first to bring them into balance with the weaker areas. This bottom tip opening is another asymmetrical tip. This is another symptom of improperly splitting the cane and splitting it across densities. So here we would also work on the strongest area first in order to bring it into alignment with the weaker areas. Again, as you become more experienced in reed making, comparing what a reed does look like with what a reed should look like can be helpful in deciding where to work. Your priorities for working on a clipped reed are first, wire adjustments, because a wire adjustment is reversible, and then scraping. Here is a wire chart showing which action on which wire results in which reaction. For example, if I need to make my reed more open and sharper, I could round the first wire. If I need to make my reed weaker, flatter, and more free-blowing, but I need to keep the tip opening the same, I could flatten the tube. Notice that rounding either wire has the same effect on the reed, except for changing the size of the tip opening. And similarly, flattening either wire has the same effect on the reed, except for changing the size of the tip opening. After gathering information from your many visual cues and considering wire work, it's time to think about scraping on a reed. Let's talk about the tools you use to adjust reeds. With all this talk of straight tapers and thick to thin, you might have been wondering how we are going to achieve this structure using a knife, which has a very narrow point of contact and is generally used by rotating the wrist or hand back and forth, causing the blade to scoop into the cane. And the answer is, we will not. 3 square diamond files. Remove cane on a relatively wide, flat plane in any direction you choose, and you can adjust the size of the cutting surface. Here is a brief introduction on how to use files.
Always draw the file against the grain of the reed. Don't go with it, go against it. Always keep your file parallel to the tabletop. And rotate and swivel and angle the reed underneath the file to achieve your desired angle of taper. So for example, if I'm going to work on the rails, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do that. If I want to work in the channels near the spine, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do this. Find exactly where I want that to be, and then work. As you approach the limits of the reed, the rails, corners of the tip, you need to roll and angle the file up on its edge so that you're using a very small surface area to scrape on the reed. These tapers are so tiny that if you use too broad of a surface area, they'll be too gradual and too broad. You need very small, very steep tapers. So as I move toward the corner of the tip, I'll roll that file up. And as I move towards the tip, I'll roll that file up. The rails, roll that file up. Support the reed underneath on the opposite blade and around where you're going to be scraping so you don't crack the blades or put more stress on the cane. Use the narrow part of the file for small adjustments and the wider part of the file for larger adjustments. If you need to make a really large adjustment, you can use a diamond pillar file. These are useful for cutting in your collars too. But I'm not going to make a round movement to cut this collar in. I'm going to find the exact angle of the taper that I want underneath a parallel file and then scrape.
Use a mandrel and plaque that are shaped like the ideal inside of a reed, so slightly and evenly tapered, and in the case of the plaque, not too thick. Finally, do use a knife or a razor blade for beveling the tip. This technique will be covered in the Day 1 practical video. Here are some basic guidelines for where to scrape for what effect. The front third of the reed, in general, is where you would scrape to affect changes to response, intonation, and tone or resonance. The middle and back thirds of the reed are where you would, in general, scrape to affect changes to the blowing quality, the flexibility, and the comfort. In general, scraping more toward the rails will make a reed seem sharper, stronger, and more resistant. In general, scraping more toward the spine will make a reed flatter, weaker, and more free-blowing. Now that we've covered what qualities cane has, where and how we work on it, and how it reacts, let's talk about the process of a first day scrape. The only way to know if a reed works is to play on it. This is a really obvious, straightforward statement, but I'd like to expand that. Judge your new reed by expecting to be able to play on it just like you would on a good finished reed. How you would play on a good finished reed is called your default embouchure and air expectations. So in other words, comparing how your reed does play with how it should play is really important. Sound familiar? We become very good at adjusting quickly to the needs of a reed. And resisting adjustment so we can decide what change needs to be made takes practice and lots of experience. The balance between staying in good enough shape with your embouchure and your air to make good reeds and having enough good reeds to stay in shape with your embouchure and air is tricky and sometimes difficult to manage. So, along with your default embouchure and air expectations, and your visual cues from the last section, a metronome and a tuner complete the jury required to pass judgment on a reed. What does this reed need in order to play in time and in tune? On day one of clipping a blank, goals can be broken down into 3 actions and 2 observations. Stabilize the intonation. Is this reed sharp or flat or unstable? Learn about the degree of response. Will this reed have good response? Balance the middle half of the reed for comfort. Is this reed comfortable to play? Here's where I share the test for learning about that degree of response. Play your 2nd octave F sharp, making a diminuendo from forte to agnente. Keep your default air and embouchure expectations. Don't hold it for too long. On a reed with good response, the F sharp will taper without going sharp, or cutting off, or losing the good substance in the sound. On a reed with bad response, the F sharp will either be sharp or go quite sharp under the pressure of your embouchure, or it will simply cut off, or you will have a very thin sound. So to rephrase what I said before, we can make the response better on a reed if it exists in the first place. I demonstrate this test in the practical section of day 1 scrape. So while you are making progress towards these goals, assess the quality of the cane. Does it respond to the trim? Does it hold the trim? How much does it change with each trim? Softer cane will react differently than harder cane. Identify if the reed is stronger wire up or wire down, and play with the stronger side up. This is really important for playing in the tenor register. You can always change your mind later as you're balancing the blades. On day 1, we are locating the good piece of cane, or pieces if you're lucky, and using our default embouchure and air expectations, visual cues, and tuner and metronome to fashion it into a workable shape. We are not trying to finish a reed into performance shape or practicing on it for a long time, because young reeds still change after drying and re-wetting. As reeds age, they become more stable, and they also get sharper, less responsive, stuffier, and more mellow. So if we aim for perfection the first day, we risk hurrying that reed into an early grave. So when your goals are met, stop. Okay, we've become familiar with our materials and tools, learned the basic theory and rules behind making adjustments, and we have a plan for action for tackling a day one scrape. Days 2 and 3 and beyond look much the same, only the adjustments become smaller and smaller. The time spent practicing and diagnosing issues in between adjustments is longer and longer, and the reed becomes more and more stable, changing less drastically between practice sessions. So, if you have chosen a good piece of cane, it has a high degree of response, and you have made well thought out decisions about where to scrape, congratulations! Now go do it again, because this reed will probably only last you a week in top form, maybe 2 if you're lucky. One more thing. If I can make changes to intonation, strength, resistance, and resonance by scraping, what is all the fuss about making changes to the shape and the internal bevel and the wire placement in all those other videos? Each of these systems by itself can only do so much in terms of affecting change. And each system taken to its extreme has really undesirable side effects.
This is why playing the bassoon and reed making for the bassoon is so difficult. This is a pitch map of my instrument, beginning at low B flat, going all the way to high E natural. This is the middle of the tuner, just about. This is 5 cents sharp, 10 cents, 15, 20, 5 cents flat, 10, 15, 20. If I put this overlay on here, this middle section represents what is relatively easy to play in tune. So for the most part, all these notes, they don't require a ton of adjustment in order to play in tune. Just to be clear, the pitch map is made by not adjusting for any notes. I played on a good reed, but I did not do any adjustments for any of these notes, and this is where they came out. It'll be different for every instrument and every person. So this overlay represents ease of playing and difficulty playing. It doesn't mean that I can't play all my notes in tune. It just means that it's more difficult to play them on these extreme edges. So what I'd like to share is just that when you, for example, my tenor register, it's really flat. In order for me to play comfortably up there, I have to make several adjustments in order to get up that direction. So the adjustments I've made have been playing on a number 1 vocal, using a slightly sharper bevel, and also a slightly narrower reed shape. My range of comfort is now up here. My mid section of intonation has shifted a little bit. So it's now fairly comfortable for me to play in the tenor register, upper register, middle lower. So, and this is to be expected for someone who plays principal bassoon in an orchestra that plays at 442. My low register is very difficult for me. I have made a lot of sacrifices in this area in order to achieve this. I can still play these notes in tune, but I have a more limited dynamic range and a more limited range of articulations that I can make on these notes. Now, I don't accept that that's the end of it. I do long tones on these notes. I practice my dynamics and my articulations and my intonation just like I do on everything else. But I also know that I cannot make my reeds do this, because if I did, they would look like this. That's more of a second bassoon setup, where they can play all these notes in tune, but they are more difficult. And these notes are perhaps something looking more like this. This is where they're playing most of the time, and those are the notes that it's important to have a full range of dynamics, a full range of articulations, and comfort in playing. So we can make all these adjustments to our reeds and all the compromises that come with it.